Dogman versus Bigfoot. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Ever since I was a kid, I wanted to see a Bigfoot. I grew up in the 1970s watching In Search Of, so I wanted to see Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, a UFO, and the paintings of Vincent van Gogh. Leonard Nimoy did an episode on Van Gogh. I don't know if you remember that one. Well, I saw some Van Goghs when I visited New York City. The colors are much brighter in person than on TV. I never saw a Nessie, and I'm now grateful I haven't met any aliens. Regarding Bigfoot, I finally did get my wish to see him when I was an adult and no longer really thought about Bigfoot all that much. It wasn't as much fun as I had anticipated when I was young. In fact, I nearly got crushed because this particular Bigfoot was preoccupied at the time, battling something that I can only assume was a dogman. Do you know about the Dyatlov Pass incident? Am I even saying that correctly? It was that situation where some skilled mountain climbers climbed a mountain that was rumored to be cursed. They were out to prove that curses are silly. Then, they all ended up dead. One of the scariest parts of the story was that the tent they had been in was destroyed by a knife from the inside. In other words, they cut themselves out of their tent. Well, remember that because my awareness of that story is quite possibly the only reason I even survived this incident. I was camping out by myself in the early days of the pandemic. I had fled to Pennsylvania from my cramped apartment in New Jersey where my roommate was driving me crazy. I was at a point where the idea of being alone was the most lovely idea in the world. Like swimming in cool water on a 100-degree day. I was so happy and relieved not to have any other people around as far as I could see. I apologize if that makes me seem like a hermit, but you haven't met my roommate in New Jersey. It was not my first night, but it was toward the end of my first week away from so-called civilization. I had grown pretty confident of my survival skills, but in reality, I hadn't been faced with any real challenges yet. That night, though, I would face enough challenges to send me back to the cramped apartment. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I forgot to mention that I was camping inside the Micho State Forest, which is around midway between Philly and Pittsburgh, not too far north of the Maryland border. It's by Gettysburg, actually. That used to be a famous place when we still had an actual school system in this country. What was I saying? Oh, right, Micho State Forest. It was so quiet and serene for the first few days. I was getting the best sleep of my adult life. I hadn't slept so well since I still believed in Santa Claus. It was so drastic a difference that I felt as though sleep in the city isn't even really sleep at all. I'm telling you, I never felt so great in my life. But then, nature decided to show me her other side, and I was taught a hard lesson. Any place you go is potentially as bad as any other place. Better to stand your ground and work to make your own place the best it can be than to run somewhere else and find the same or even bigger problems. And yes, when I say bigger, I'm talking about Bigfoot. And again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Actually, screw it. Let's jump right into the main part of the story. I was fast asleep in my tent in a clearing somewhere in the middle of the forest. I was dreaming that I was visiting an apartment in Manhattan where you could go to visit all four of the Monkees rock group. Davey and Peter were alive in there too. It wasn't their beachfront apartment from TV and the movies. It was a sort of a typical Manhattan apartment as far as I know. They were being so friendly to me and I didn't understand why. But all of a sudden, Mike and Mickey both stomped on my feet and I woke up screaming. Once awake, I rushed back to the reality that I was in a tent in the woods, only now the tent seemed to be crushed down by something and my feet were in great pain. Something was pressing the tent down onto my feet, and I didn't understand what. My toes were only under the very edge of whatever that was, and I was able to pull myself out from under it. Everything was extremely disorienting, and I thought, avalanche. This is because I was thinking about that Dyatlov Pass incident, and in my half-awake state, I thought I was about to be crushed by an avalanche. I got my Swiss Army knife out and I cut myself out of the edge of the tent furthest from whatever had been pressing down on my feet. Rising out of the tent into the dark night, I heard a screaming so loud and so shocking that I leaped in the air and hobbled away on two very pained feet, making it to the tree line before even looking back to see where the scream was coming from. Once inside a patch of trees, I risked looking behind me, assuming that the screamer was chasing me. What I saw was far more surprising than that, and nearly as terrifying. The thing that had been pressing down on my feet was not Mickey and Mike from the Monkees, but you could say it was a monkey of some sort. A huge creature that had to be Bigfoot had been what stepped on my tent. I had been trapped under the edge of its heel. If it had stepped back just a few more inches, it would have broken every bone in both my feet. But as it was, it had still hurt me pretty badly. The Sasquatch, or whatever it was, had not stepped onto the tent on purpose. It wasn't trying to attack me or anything. In fact, I don't think it was even aware that I was there. The creature was facing away from me, you see, and it was trading punches with another creature just as large, but entirely different in appearance from itself. I'm going to try to describe both huge animals as I saw them, because it's not like I saw them and said, hey, there's Bigfoot and Dogman fighting. I did not really expect Bigfoot to look like this, and I didn't even know that there was such a thing as Dogman. What I was looking at was something my brain had no names for. I was really looking at them the way an infant looks out at the world, seeing everything new for the first time. Imagine a gorilla with longer legs and better posture. Then imagine it seeming more brown than black in terms of its fur. Both creatures appeared brown in the moonlight. Maybe that wouldn't be the case in the daylight. The man-like giant gorilla was facing away from me. I had a good view of its back. I noticed the brown fur mainly because I was expecting to see silver on its back, and I did not. He was holding the other creature with his left hand clutched tightly around the thing's throat. With his right hand, he was making a fist and pummeling it the way a professional wrestler would pummel his opponent. He wasn't stomping the canvas each time he threw a punch, though. He was really connecting. The other creature was even scarier to see. It was not a Bigfoot at all. It looked like something out of a horror movie, but Bigfoot was getting the best of him at first. He was far more angular than the Sasquatch. It had pointed ears and a long pointed snout, and long sharp pointed teeth, and long sharp-pointed claws on both its raccoon-like hands and dog-like feet. And it was those claws which it used to get free of that Bigfoot, too. The ape-man was holding the dog-man's throat tightly and twisting his head so that it pointed skyward. The dog-man was swinging its arms and legs blindly in front of it, missing at first. I knew when he had connected because the Bigfoot let out a pained shriek so loud that it hurt my ears, and they kept ringing through to the next day. My ears felt like someone had driven a screwdriver into them. It was extraordinarily unpleasant. At that point, the dogman was released and the Bigfoot seemed preoccupied with the wounds that had just been inflicted on it. The dog barked loudly at the creature, and I got a good look at it for the first time. The two of them were both giants. They had to be well over 7 feet. They were much, much larger than any human being could ever be. I'm not a good judge of height, but this was ridiculous, like maybe 10 feet, 11. And they did not seem young either. They seemed mature somehow. I don't know what mature is in terms of age for Bigfoot or Dogman, but these were adults, and they had been adults for some time. The dog-headed creature was even more humanoid than the Bigfoot, except for its canine head and immense canine legs and feet. What I mean to say is that its torso looked like a man, whereas Bigfoot's torso looked more like an upright walking gorilla or a giant chimpanzee. The canine creature had predator's teeth like a carnivore, while the Bigfoot had teeth more like a human, possibly indicating that it was an omnivore like us. The two of them went into a series of displays intended to intimidate each other, baring their teeth and acting like they were ready to rip the other one apart. The Bigfoot kept making motions with its arms like it was telling the dogman to get out of there, but the dogman was barking and growling and making constant eye contact with the Sasquatch. Finally, the canine creature leaped toward the Bigfoot, who screamed like a woman and ran in my direction. Every time I watched giant kaiju movies as a kid, I wondered why the people would always run away from the monsters instead of running, to the side of the monsters and letting them pass. Like, why stay in the path of the thing that is running after you? Why not run left or right and just get out of its way? Well, in the nightmare of that night, I found myself running deeper into the woods, running away from the two creatures, and yet continuing to remain directly in their path. Maybe I was actually in a monster film. I don't know. I can't explain why I did that. Behind me, the two behemoths were literally knocking trees down, and I was hyperventilating. I discovered that if you think you're about to be crushed to death by giant monsters in the night, your vision improves drastically. My eyes must have been more dilated than a black-eyed kid's eyes, because everything got so bright and clear and vivid as I ran for my life. Time seemed to slow down, and I saw every detail of every leaf on every tree. If these were going to be the last few moments of my life, at least they were going to be well-observed moments. I saw a man standing in the woods to my right. He was almost as tall as the monsters, and he was wearing all white. He motioned for me to come toward him, and my first instinct was that this guy's as scary as what's about to crush me from behind. I had no feeling at all inside me telling me to run toward him, but for whatever reason I did. From behind me, I heard this sound that you know, but you don't know how you know. I was hearing a big tree tipping over, and when I turned my head, my eyes confirmed what I already knew it was. A big tree collapsed to the ground where I had been just a few seconds earlier, and the dogman chased the Bigfoot over the fallen tree and away to my right in the woods. If that man hadn't called me over, I would have been flatter than a pancake. I turned to thank the big strange guy, but nobody was there. I would have felt scared about it, but I was already shaking all over from the two creatures having almost terminated me with extreme prejudice. I really didn't think about that man again till days later, and then when I did, I figured he must have been a projection from my subconscious or something like that. When I tell people this story, they often say it was my guardian angel, and to them I ask, well, how do you know your guardian angel isn't some projection of your subconscious? I went back to my tent, which was obviously destroyed. My backpack was mostly intact, so I grabbed up what I could and started hiking out of there in the middle of the night. I know that's a stupid thing to do, but I was half awake, and I was absolutely terrified, worse than I had ever been in my life. I felt a deep need to get away from that spot. It was almost as though I thought it was haunted. I am not trying to say I was behaving logically because I know that I was not. Maybe that so-called guardian angel was watching over me, though, because I did get home safe. It reminded me of when I was younger and I would be heading home from seeing rock bands play on the Lower East Side of Manhattan while the sun was coming up. The trip home was more dangerous than any other part of the evening, but you always had a sense of excitement and pride because you had seen a great and inspiring show. And I guess this time I felt pride just that I had survived seeing the knockdown, drag-out fight between Dogman versus Bigfoot. Hope you liked that all-new allegedly true story, but if you didn't, don't worry. We've got a lot more of them in this 2-hour special, mostly selected from stories you guys voted for. We've got Dogman's biggest battles coming up, but first I'd like to say thank you to Godzilla Tim Walker, who is our main executive producer of the day. I'll be shouting him out again later in the program, and I've even got a Godzilla Tim rhyme coming up. You know, we couldn't do this show without our executive producers. If you'd like to help us stay on the air or wherever we are, please consider joining our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com, or else do what Godzilla Tim Walker did and click that join link below any of our videos to become a channel member. We've got some cool perks including secret episodes, and we'll tell you more about them later on. But now, let's jump straight to our second story of this extra long 2-hour episode, which we call Dogman versus DogWOMAN. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got a story for you from last summer when my wife and I went camping alone through all sorts of wilderness in Pennsylvania. Yes, it's a story about the Dogman, but it's also a story about the DogWOMAN. I've been made aware by your old pal Bigfoot that most people in this audience are mainly interested in the cryptid sightings, not so much in the stories of the humans who witnessed the creatures. To me and my wife, though, this is a very personal account of something that changed our attitudes towards ourselves and each other in profound ways. I would say it was a combination of the pandemic situation and these two horrific monsters that, instead of breaking us down, showed us a new way to derive meaning from everyday life. I'll try not to get too personal or too boring, but the deep change that was brought into both of our lives is still, almost a full year later, something I wish I could share with every one of you in order to allow you the same insights that were given to us by living through these events. So, like a lot of people who had no work in 2020, my wife, who we can call Martha, and I took off into the great unknown. Our intention was to camp our way all across America. We didn't make it to the West Coast. We actually turned back in Altoona, Ohio, when the weather started to get cold and Martha got a job offer back in New Jersey. That's where we started from. At the point in our summer-long adventure that I want to tell you about, Martha and I were hiking along the Appalachian Trail through what I believe was Bethel, Pennsylvania. The Appalachian Trail in that area is very much like being in untouched wilderness, except you continually see markers and signs and constructions left behind humans who've been on that road for generations. Sometimes we wouldn't see people for hours and hours, but we always knew that wherever we were on the trail, many people had already stood on the same spot. So it can feel quaint and homey and civilized, while at the same time feeling as wild as Jurassic Park. One time we saw a bear, and another time we met an artist who said he drew for the New Yorker. It was like being everywhere and nowhere at the same moment. So, one day in July or August, we came upon what looked like a beautiful lake in the middle of nowhere, a perfect place to camp in nature. Upon closer inspection, however, you realize that the wall of the lake is made of stone bricks, and this is most likely a man-made reservoir, placed there specifically for people to camp out by. So much for deep wilderness. There were nights we camped in pitch blackness, listening to animals moving through the woods all around us, and there were other nights when loud music from nearby campers kept us up half the night. When I first came upon the reservoir, I ran back to Martha excitedly to tell her about it. I thought she would be as happy as I was to find it on a day when nobody else was there. I thought she would find it exotic and romantic, our own private lagoon to be shipwrecked at, with nobody around as far as the eye could see. Our own private paradise. Well, When she saw it, her foul expression did not lighten even in the slightest. It was a hot day and I couldn't wait to strip and jump inside that water. When I told Martha my plans and invited her to join me, she shrieked in horror, and I knew drama was about to manifest itself. "The water looks murky," she exclaimed as though she were in a theater, making sure the people in the back row could hear her. "Who knows what's swimming under the surface of that water?" she bellowed. I told her there was probably nothing swimming in there at all, and she interrupted to say that's because the water's probably poisoned, which was one of those non sequiturs that your wife issues when she has decided that you are going to have a full-scale argument, period. Even married only 1 year, I already knew I had lost the argument, and yet she was going to drag it onward for a really long time just to make it hurt a lot more. She had decided I was a bad person and that I was victimizing her, and therefore we were going to have to go through the entire reenactment of every single fight we'd ever had, from start to finish. When Martha gets in the mood for a fight like this, she always apologizes 3 days later and always swears she'll never be so mean to me again. But 28 or 29 days afterwards, she inevitably is using the same false arguments to hurt me as badly as she can. If I try not to take it personally, she will notice that, and then she'll pull out the big guns and talk about divorce, or tell me terrible things her mother said about me, or reveal things about herself that I just don't want to know. So, that afternoon, I set up camp while being lectured that I was abusing her by setting up camp, and she never wanted to go hiking in the first place, and she should have married my worst enemy instead of me, and so on and so forth. Once I had the camp set up, I went for a swim in the water, and it was glorious. I wished she would join me, but I knew better than to ask her. Each time I came up for air, she told me more about the bacteria that lives in stagnant water and how I was probably going to end up with a flesh-eating disease. I built up a fire and made some dinner, which Martha refused to eat, saying I was starving her with my bad cooking. I asked her why she never cooked dinner for us, and I got a lecture about how I was a macho pig who expected women to cook and clean for him. It was one unfair attack on me after the next, and I began to wish I had gone camping alone. I know some of you are complaining right now that you don't want to hear about this stuff, but it has everything to do with the Dogman sighting that happened shortly after dinner, when I put out our campfire and decided to try to get to sleep early. I had stopped in a town the month prior to get myself an old-school MP3 player and some white noise MP3s. Initially, I used it to block out loud campers on nights when we couldn't find a solitary enough place to stay, but on that night, I learned that it worked pretty well to block out my wife lecturing and nagging me to try to keep the fight going. I was dreaming a weird dream about meeting the Beatles in London at a party back before I was born, and I didn't want to wake up from that. When she started shaking me back and forth in my sleep to get me up, I took out my earbuds and glared at her, asking her what the problem was now. As soon as I saw her eyes, I knew this wasn't about her being angry any longer. It was about her being scared, as in terrified. I wondered if we were in some real kind of danger, or if she was once again making a mountain out of a molehill. She whispered to me that someone was in the water, and when I listened, I could also hear splashing outside. My heart started beating fast and hard, but I tried to remain calm in order not to alarm Martha any further. If it was Jason Voorhees or Michael Myers out there, I didn't want him to hear us squabbling before he did us in. Sticking my head out of the tent, I was surprised at how full and bright the moon was. I could see our location almost as well as I would have been able to at dusk or dawn, and the moon reflected brightly off the water. Brightly enough, in fact, that I could clearly see that there was a huge dog swimming in that water. Pulling back into the tent and zipping back up, I told my wife it was just a dog, and that she should go back to sleep. "It's a dog?" she asked. "What kind of a dog?" "I don't know what kind of a dog," I answered, putting my white noise MP3 back on. "It's just a big old dog. Leave him alone and I'm sure he'll leave us alone. I know she was saying something, so I turned my volume up to the max and I tried to get back to my Beatles dream. Soon, Martha was shaking me awake more roughly than before, and so I took out my earbuds and forced myself not to glare at her. She was completely frantic by this point, and she was saying something about werewolves. There was a family of werewolves, she said, and it was going to kill us both. That was what she told me in between hyperventilating. I looked at her like she was crazy, and I had to grit my teeth to prevent myself from saying the angry things that I really wanted to say to her. In truth, there was a horrible caterwauling coming from out by the water. It sounded like two angry dogs threatening each other, and on the verge of engaging in violent battle. "What would you like me to do about the werewolves, honey?" I asked her. "Call Frankenstein and Dracula and have them tag team wrestle each other?" I apologize to all of you out there who have had experiences with the Dogman. I had not even heard of the creature at the time. It's not a huge cultural thing in Hoboken where we live. I only knew about werewolves from the movies. And to be honest, I didn't even find werewolf movies all that scary or interesting at the time. Next to mummies, I found werewolves the most boring movie villains. I see now that I was being sarcastic and flippant about something that's pretty terrible to actually encounter, but at the time, I just thought it was my wife's need for attention gone out of control, and my temper had been frayed to the breaking point. Martha wasn't being mean to me any longer, though. She was really scared. She begged me to look outside and see what she was seeing, and I began to wonder if she'd completely lost her mind. Better to humor her than to argue any further, I figured, so I took a look outside as she had requested. The dog that was swimming in the reservoir earlier was still there, still doing exactly that. But now, there was a second character in the scene, another large canine, and I had to climb further out of the tent to get a clear look at her. I say her, because I could see the biology on her belly that meant she was a female dog and not a male one. How could I see this in the moonlight from across the small reservoir? Easy. She was standing up on her hind legs. I was so surprised by what I was witnessing that I pulled myself the rest of the way out of the tent and sat there, cross-legged, watching the scene. The two creatures were so involved in their antagonism toward each other that it was clear they were paying no attention to me at all. So I was watching this big, black-furred female standing on her hind legs right on the edge of the water, barking and growling viciously at the male dog in the water. It was almost like they were speaking a language at each other, but I may have just thought that because I had only woken up a minute prior. It could have been my imagination. Something that Lady Dogman said, though, angered the other one so much that he doggy-paddled over to her side and rose out of the water in a furious manner, adopting an angry body pose that caused her to back up a few steps. Dripping with water, the larger dog, who was clearly and unmistakably a biological male, shook the water off him in that way that dogs do, and then he stood up bipedally like the female had done. I reached in the tent and tugged on my wife's sleeve. I wanted her to see what I was seeing. And so we watched as that male dog got right in the face of the slightly smaller female, and she got right back in his. They were snapping at each other as though they were mortal enemies, and I thought they were going to tear each other to ribbons. "It's a turf battle," whispered my wife to me. I found her idea interesting, but I had a different idea of what we were witnessing. Suddenly, the female viciously charged the male, who fell backward into the water, sending drops everywhere, reaching all the way over to our side of the reservoir like a midsummer rainstorm. The female dove in after him, and before we knew it, both dogs were furiously paddling in our direction. Panicked and not thinking clearly, Martha and I both ran off into the forest behind us, hiding behind trees and peeking out at the reservoir. The two immense dog people clashed in the water, as though they each wanted the other one dead. Our tent area became somewhat flooded, as did much of the land around the reservoir. I never heard two dogs sound that angry before, and I had a great uncle who trained guard dogs. Even though I don't think the dog people had even noticed us yet, I joined my wife in thinking that we were probably both gonna end up losing our lives before the sun came up. Obviously, that's not what happened, though. The two monstrous canines tore out of the reservoir and began to chase each other into the woods to our right. We stayed in our hiding spots, too afraid to move for what had to have been a half hour at least. We could hear them breaking branches and knocking smaller trees down in their mad pursuit of each other, and every so often, it sounded like one of them caught up to and wounded the other one. I heard the kind of howling that a creature only makes when it's in great pain, and I heard it multiple times that night before the two of them had run too far away for us to hear them at all any longer. I wanted to go back and dry out our area, but my wife was a wreck, and she begged me to stay with her instead. She felt safe in her hiding spot behind the tree, and it was dry there at least, so I did as she asked. By the time we woke up in the morning, I had a sore back and a stiff neck, but other than that, we were both fine. The morning sun had already dried up much of the watery, muddy mess from the night before, and birds sang in the trees as though nothing had happened at all. I made some breakfast, and my wife picked at it, but at least she didn't pick at me any longer. When we finally packed up and got moving again, Martha once again expressed her opinion that we had witnessed a turf battle. I pointed out that the second dogman was actually a dog woman, a fact which my wife had completely missed in the excitement. So, either dogmen get into turf wars with females of their species, or, more likely, we witnessed a battle between two mates. We had been witness to a domestic squabble between two undomesticated creatures. That must be what we look like, said Martha distractedly. I asked her what she meant, and she said, when we squabble, we probably look as savage and crazy as those two dog people looked to us last night. Our fights are probably just as pointless and insane as that one had seemed to be as well. Why do we fight like that? She asked me, and I just rolled my eyes and said, I don't know, honey. But inside my mind, I wondered if our fight and their fight had both been caused by the exact same thing. In my opinion, that would be the full moon itself. Martha swore to never be so mean to me again, and she held to that promise for a full 28 or 29 days when it all started over again. I won't say that our fighting has lessened even in the slightest since we witnessed that knockdown, drag-out battle of the century in and around that beautiful hidden reservoir in the wilds of Pennsylvania. But I will say that each time our new fight ends, we both look at each other in the eyes and we know exactly why it happened. The fights continue unabated, but our makeup sessions are far more fulfilling now. We both feel we learned something from each of our battles, about ourselves, about each other, and about nature in general. We also both fully believe now in the effect of the full moon on our brains and nervous systems, and we feel forever transformed by what we learned from the epic battle between Dogman versus DogWOMAN. That fight was like the Thriller in Manila, and now here's a rhyme about Godzilla. Godzilla Tim, our executive producer, he's a winner and not a loser. We couldn't do it without him, so please join me in thanking Godzilla Tim. Godzilla Tim is such a great executive producer that he even sent us his own Dogman story, which I'm going to tell you in a second. If you'd like to become a Scary Stories executive producer like Godzilla Tim, just join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com, or click the join link under this or any of our videos to become a channel member. PQ Ribber will be back in a minute to tell you about all that in greater detail, but first let me tell you Godzilla Tim's Dogman story, which we will call Godzilla Tim's Dogman Story by Godzilla Tim. Dear Scary Stories NYC, for the past 10 years I've been confined to my bed thanks to a simple injury that decided to turn difficult. That story is far longer than my encounter story. During the last quarter of 2019, I was preparing to settle down to sleep. Next thing I heard was the front door handle being turned quite forcefully. I was surprised that my dog never made a noise. She even went under my bed. I was not frightened. For years, when I have been face to face with a dangerous person or situation, my fear switch seems to disappear. So I did the only thing that seemed natural at the time. I yelled at the top of my lungs, "Who the blank is at my door at this time of the morning?" Everything went quiet. I tried to look at my outside security camera, but guess what? It wasn't working. I then tried to put my electric blind up. That wasn't working either. I got pretty frustrated. Next minute, it sounded like the front door was being busted in. The noise of something colliding with the door was so loud, I thought the door would come in any second. That is when I heard what I thought was something grumbling. Even though I thought I knew what was happening, I got angry. I kept my voice steady and once again shouted who was at my door behaving like that. Again, silence. So I let off a barrage of expletives. I finished off with "get away the flip out of it." It went quiet again, and it stayed quiet. For a couple of nights anyway. There were no more noises, but I kept getting the vibe that there was something about outside. A certain bipedal canid. And once again, my dog was quiet all night. I couldn't believe that that night of all nights, neither my electric blind nor my security camera was working, as though something supernatural were outside. Something supernatural, like the Dogman. Dogman and Wendigo experience. Dear Scary Stories NYC, this is a story from the mid-1970s when I was in my early 20s. It was either 1974 or 1975, but I haven't been able to narrow it down any further than that. I was living in a van with two girlfriends of mine, which may sound strange to you youngsters listening to my story. Back then, you could be poor and you could still have multiple women. It helped if you were an artist or a musician. I was both. And it helped if you were of mixed race like I am as well. Women were interested in genius back then, and women followed after mavericks and individualists. It was nothing like modern society. It wasn't all phony and money-based. Most of the women I knew wanted an adventure with a guy that would give their parents a heart attack, and I was the symbol of that. I was the bad boy that nobody wanted their daughter to hang around with. Sorry if you found all that boring, but it's important to start there so that you understand the situation that existed when several of us experienced weird monsters in the Great Lakes region back then, including both the Wendigo and the Dogman. I am descended from the Algonquin people on my mother's side, and my father was a mix of Caucasian and African. Don't ask me the percentages of each, since I honestly don't know. I was gonna get one of those DNA tests done until I found out that giving up your DNA allows them to use it for whatever they want. If they decide to make an army of clones of you, it's totally legal because you've given over copyright of yourself to them. So, I'd rather remain in the dark as to the exact percentages of my genetics. Culturally, my mother passed down traditions and stories to me. She was not full-blooded Algonquin either, but she was raised in the old traditions mixed into the realities of 20th century life. Now, although living in a van implies mobility, I generally stayed in one basic area. There's a strip of land connected to Wisconsin, but technically considered to be Michigan, that lies to the south of Lake Superior and the north of Lake Michigan. It's only about 65 miles from north to south, so you can drive from one coast to the other in only around an hour, at least if the traffic is light. There are lots of natural areas on this strip of land, including the Hiawatha National Forest and the Gwynn State Forest area. And at least back then, there were plenty of places to hide your van and live the good life. I literally haven't been back there since around 1979, so I don't know anything about what it's like there now. But back then, if you knew the area, you could live off the grid and have yourself a ball. It might sound like an isolated life, but in fact, my ladies and I had a wide group of friends we would party with. We had all grown up in the area and gone to school there, and we had buddies who were straight and on the grid. We had other buddies who were hippies but still working straight jobs, and we had completely off-the-grid friends who were total freaks, like we were. We had a TV set in our van, and back then, you could pull TV shows in for free from the air itself, using just a little metal stick that they called an antenna. There was no Facebook, so if the government wanted to spy on you, they would have to actually physically sneak into your home somehow, and then physically place a microphone or other spying object in your phone or in your room. These days, you people fall all over yourself volunteering your information for the government to use against you. We were too smart to trust the government. These days, they've actually made it legal to use the media to lie to you, and yet some of you still believe TV and the government. We were safer from overreach back then, plus we were more aware of their abuse of power. These days, you have fewer protections remaining, plus you think the government is your pal. So make fun of my people and my time all you want, but the joke is on you. Now, I did not ever get involved in the dealing or selling of contraband material or items, but I did have friends who were very involved in all of that. We expected to be spied on just because of who we knew, and so we were careful what we said and careful who we hung out with or allowed in our van. When one of my ladies, let's call her Bedelia, brought a young man to hang with us one night, my other lady, who we can call Ophelia, was suspicious of him, and so was I. Bedelia said this was her cousin, and we can call him Sven. Cousin Sven seemed like he was tweaking on something or other, but he kept insisting he was sober. According to Sven, the reason he was shaking all over was because he had been getting stalked by what he called a Wendigo. I told him the word was Wendigo, not Wendigo, and I suggested that if he were really being stalked by that spirit, he'd probably be dead already. This guy did not appear to be famished or hungry to me, as those cursed by the Wendigo can sometimes become. He was kinda chubby, to be blunt about it. I wondered about his state of mind on the one hand, and I wondered if he might be a spy on the other hand. Sven wanted to stay with us for a while to hide from the supposed Wendigo, so I needed to figure out what he was talking about. He was not a native, and I didn't even know where he got the terminology from that he was using. He said he heard about the Wendigo from an educational program he saw on Saturday morning TV, and that he realized that must be what was stalking him. Lord only knows what he meant by educational. When I asked him if the creature had a physical form, he described something very specific. It was something that plenty of you might already be familiar with, but which neither of my ladies nor I had ever heard of at the time. The figure looked, he said, like a malnourished buck deer. A big buck, but a starving one. And he said it walked on its hind legs. I didn't know if he was out of his mind or if he was really seeing that, but it didn't match any description of the Wendigo that I had ever heard of. Flash forward to last month. My grandson was watching a YouTube video in my house. I don't think it was from your channel, but it had an image of a deer man with big antlers. It froze me in my tracks, and I asked him, "What the hell is that?" He was like, "Duh, boomer, that's a Wendigo." To say I was stunned would be an understatement. Since then, I've learned a lot. Well, Let's say I've begun to learn a lot about modern versions of the Wendigo. Before you think I'm just pulling stuff out of my butt, I want to quote this bit I found on Wikipedia. Wikipedia says, and I quote, "In indigenous representations, the Wendigo is described as a giant humanoid with a heart of ice. A foul stench or sudden, unseasonable chill might precede its approach. Possibly due to long-time identification by Europeans with their own superstitions about werewolves, Hollywood film representations often label human-beast hybrids featuring antlers or horns with the Wendigo name. But such animal features do not appear in the original indigenous stories." Now, I might not believe everything I read on Wikipedia, but this part backs up what I'm saying. My mother and my grandmother never said anything about antlers or deer when they told me cautionary tales about the Wendigo. But on the other hand, Wikipedia's assertion that this is purely the invention of Hollywood doesn't ring true for me either, since this guy I'm calling Sven was seeing one years before Hollywood had their turn messing with the mythology. So, what was this guy seeing? And why did he call it a Wendigo? I'm not really all that sure of the answers in either case, but believe me, things were only starting to get weird. I wanted Sven to go. I didn't want him staying in our van. He was either crazy or he was haunted. Being crazy could mess up our situation in one way, and being haunted or cursed could obviously mess us up in entirely different ways. I didn't want whatever was after him to come after us. The problem was, he claimed he hadn't slept in days, and from the looks of him, he was probably being honest about that part at least. We had to at least let him crash for a while, get some sleep, feed him something, let him recover some strength, and then we could kick him out. Believe me, once he laid down on our shag carpeting, he went out like a light. I never saw someone go to sleep so fast unless they were in the ring and got punched by a heavyweight. So that night, my ladies and I were trying to chill in the van, and Sven was cramping our space, snoring and rolling around on the floor, muttering paranoid nonsense. We went outside since it was a nice night, and we went for a walk over to the lake. We were parked on the north side of that land bridge between the lakes, which meant we were right by the southern edge of Lake Superior. On clear nights, over there, you could actually sometimes see across to Canada, but this night was a foggy night. It really looked like we were in a scene from a horror movie, and it gave me the creeps. Still, it was better in the fog than cramped in a van with the crazy chubby guy who called Wendigos Wendingos. Even though it was a warm night, we kept shivering, all three of us. I remember having my arms around both girls, and them having their arms around me. We could hear soft moans coming from the water, which is so vast over there it might as well be an ocean. We tried to figure out what that sound was coming from, as it sounded like whimpering children out in the fog. We decided it must be wood creaking, maybe? Or birds? Or... After a while, we stopped trying to guess because it really didn't sound like anything but children in distress. Every time you thought it had stopped, it would waft in through the foggy lake once more, and we get a chill that went straight down to the bones. There was a feeling of ominous dread in the air, and after some time, we accepted that there was nothing we could do about it except sit there, silently trying to give each other emotional support. We heard what sounded like a woman's high-pitched scream coming not from the water, but back from the woods where we had left the van. Bedelia shouted Sven, and the three of us took off running back into the dark trees. We saw the van in the clearing ahead of us, but we froze in our tracks and hid behind some trees because of what else we saw besides the van. There, on the other side of my mystery machine, was the thing that this guy Sven had been saying that he was seeing. It was an incredibly tall, upright walking creature that looked not unlike a deer with mange. It was a male deer, judging by the rack of antlers that looked too large to even be supported by the animal's scrawny, mangy neck. By mangy, I mean that large patches of fur were missing, and it looked emaciated. It looked like it was starving to death, and yet it still seemed remarkably strong, as its front hooves landed hard and loudly over and over on the roof of my van. It was trying to get in at Sven. It had found him, and as a consequence, it had found us. At the time, I did not think of this thing as a Wendigo, as it did not match the stories I had been told by the matriarchy who raised me. Nevertheless, I could not deny its existence, and I could not deny the danger it clearly brought with it. I wondered if there might be a way to dispel it, assuming it was some form of ancient spirit as Sven had insisted that it was. Spirits can be attracted, but they can also sometimes be repelled. How could we repel this entity before it wrecked my van and destroyed our lives? At that moment, we heard that sound again, which from a distance seemed to sound like a high-pitched human scream. It was clearly emanating from that tall, terrifying, deer-like specter, not from Sven inside the van. It was truly eardrum-piercing and painful to hear, but up close, it sounded different than it had sounded by the lake. At times, it was almost like a chainsaw motor, but sometimes it sounded like something metallic, and other times it sounded like the wail of a banshee. Smoke or fog, or mist maybe, floated around this creature, and the sound floated around it in a similar manner. I honestly don't know what I would have done next, but I didn't have to make any decisions as something else besides us had been bothered by that terrible screeching sound. An immense, freakish dog, standing upright like the antlered thing, charged at the monster and took him down like a football player tackling the quarterback. At this point, not only was I just about as frightened as the girls were, but I was utterly confused on top of it. Sven seemed convinced that he was being haunted by Algonquin spirits, yet neither of these figures resembled anything I had been taught about by my elders. Of course, I'm not calling myself a scholar of the traditions in any way. I only would have known what had been passed down to me, and it's possible that there are legends that explain what we were seeing that I'm just not aware of. Be that as it may, I had no idea what I was looking at. It's only been in the last month or two that my grandson gave this old boomer a lesson on what he called real-life monsters, such as the antlered version of the Wendigo, and of course, the Michigan Dogman. There was no way my grandson could have known what I had seen in the 70s, and there was no way he could have known that I saw it in Michigan. The coincidences were flying, and I was increasingly amazed. I told him this story I am in the middle of telling you, and he acted unimpressed. He shrugged his shoulders and said, "Yep, that was a dogman attacking a Wendigo," and then he continued murdering dozens of people in whatever video game he was playing. The most surprising, shocking, and confusing thing I ever experienced, but it's just another day in the mind of my grandson. So, back to the 1970s now. The Dogman, as I now know it is called, was just like a man in many ways, but it was unclothed and covered in brownish and grayish fur. It was not mangy. The fur looked healthy and full and covered its entire body, other than, I suppose, the toes, which were a canine, the tip of its dog-like nose leather at the end of its snout, and the palms of its very not dog-like hands. It did have dog claws, but not dog paws. It had hands unlike any animal that I can think of. They looked like something from a Tom Savini movie, something out of the 1980s horror movies that I used to watch on VHS during the video rental store era. I wonder if you even know what a video store was. I'm not sure how out of date my boomer references are. I'm trying to say that the hands look like monster hands from a Halloween costume, not like anything that a wolf or a dog might actually have. We hid and watched the Dogman battling the Wendigo or whatever that thing was. The canine at first had the advantage, in spite of not being as tall as the Wendigo. Or maybe those immense antlers just made the deer-like spirit being seem taller. He was thin, though, emaciated, whereas the Dogman was muscular and built like a brick house, almighty mighty. As the two grappled and wrestled, though, a strange thing seemed to happen. I remember watching this scene and wondering if I were hallucinating. I kept asking the girls what they were seeing, and it was the same thing I was seeing. The fur of the Wendigo began to fill itself in, and the creature stopped looking quite so skinny. The werewolf, on the other hand, was losing its hair in big chunks and seemed to be losing weight and muscle mass as well. The Wendigo creature, in other words, seemed to be sapping the very life force itself out of the Dogman and was becoming stronger and less emaciated in the process. The dog-headed creature, realizing it was losing energy, emitted a terribly sad moan or howl and ran off, at first on its hind legs, then dropping to all fours and disappearing deeper into the woods. The now much stronger and even larger antlered creature issued a roar unlike any I'd ever heard before and walked swiftly off in the direction the wolf had charged away in. Realizing this was our chance, the three of us ran to the opposite side of the van and opened the big door. There, on the shag rug, was the still snoring Sven. How the hell could he still be asleep, I asked, and I forget if it was Bedelia or Ophelia who suggested that maybe the creature had been born out of his dreams. I jumped in the driver's seat and drove us out of the woods and onto a highway, all the time quizzing Bedelia where we could take Sven. I said he can't stay with us any longer and asked if they had any relatives in the area who might take him in. She woke Sven up and they had an argument about it. Eventually, they settled on an uncle that we could at least try to leave him off at. Once I had the address, I started planning out how to get to there from where we were. When we finally arrived at the house, it was after midnight, and Sven didn't want to bother his uncle at that hour. The three of us had been shaken up badly by what we had been forced to witness, so we walked him to the front door and rang the bell. We were met by a very straight but very kindly older couple in their pajamas. We got lucky in that they were starved for a visit from relatives, and they invited Sven and Bedelia in. She stayed there for a few days as Ophelia and I split it for the north coast of Lake Michigan to our south. We wanted to be as far away from the scene of the monster appearances as possible without leaving that part of Michigan up near Canada. Bedelia rejoined us in a few days, saying that things were fine at first, but then Sven inexplicably ran away to parts unknown. She didn't see the Wendigo again, but it's possible Sven saw it. At any rate, we never went back to those woods we had seen the monsters in, and we never saw the creature or spirit, or whatever it was, ever again. We got lucky that it didn't catch our scent or attach to us, or whatever it is that those things do to people like Sven. Bedelia lived into the 21st century, and Ophelia sent me an email just last Christmas, so hopefully she's still alive, but all three of us could have had our energies eaten by that thing, and we all could have been snuffed out in our youth. I have no idea what happened to Sven, and I'm not sure I would ever want to find out. The fact does not elude me that I never would have gotten any answers to what exactly happened that night if my grandson were not into YouTube monster videos. The elements of chance and coincidence play such a large role in this story from beginning to end. It's only made me more grateful, though. I mean, my grandson would never have even been born if the creature had finished me off that night. I find the whole thing amazing, but my grandson says I'm just being dramatic, and then he returns to slaughtering hordes of people in his game. I hope at least some people listening to this can relate to why I find this story from my past so incredibly creepy. I hope nothing ever happens to you as frighteningly freaky as my Dogman and Wendigo experience. She brings happiness, fear she subverts. Executive producer S.P. Roberts. How much greater can you get than our EP, Sheila Paulette? Please join us in thanking today's executive producer, Sheila Paulette Roberts, for making this episode possible. In return, Shelia gets to watch our secret uncensored Sunday stories, and you can too. Just join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com or click the join link under this or any of our videos and become a channel member. Dogman versus Mountain Lion. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I used to be a hunter, but now in my middle age, I no longer have the stomach for it. I don't judge my friends who continue to hunt, and I'm not a vegetarian or anything. I've just had life come at me for a few decades, and I've had to endure some horrible things that you don't need to know about. These days, I go out and use the scope on my rifle to observe nature, but I never fire on it. Why not just detach the scope from the weapon and go out with that alone, some people ask me. Those people have never been charged at by a bear, which actually happened to me one time. I said I was done with hunting, but I didn't say I wouldn't defend myself. I'm not suicidal. I just don't have it in me to end the life of anything or anyone that means me no harm. That's why I only hunt for things to look at these days. And it was my new pastime of hunting for animals to observe from a distance that led me to seeing what I think must have been the cryptid known as Dogman in battle with the largest puma or mountain lion that I ever saw. This all happened one late afternoon as I was chillaxing in the Fish Lake Wildlife area, which is in Grantsburg, Wisconsin. I was using my scope to watch some kind of pretty bird that I don't know the name of when I saw leaves rustling in a tree, and I changed my focus to those moving leaves. I was pretty certain that I saw a big branch bending under the weight of a mountain lion or a cougar, but a bigger one than any man in the world. I looked those animals up since that day, and officially there aren't supposed to be any pumas or other cats larger than a bobcat located in Wisconsin at all anymore. Not for at least 100 years. But Grantsburg is just a stone's throw from the Minnesota border, and about 75 miles north of Minneapolis itself. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because mountain lions are seen at least once a year these days in Minnesota. And by these days, I mean every year since 2008, which is not a short bit of time. It's become accepted that the big cats are back in Minnesota, so I don't think it's a huge leap to accept that a small population of them might exist in the Wisconsin wild areas that are located close by Minnesota. This was the first time I had seen one of these animals outside of a zoo, and I was aware of the rarity of my sighting. Some might go beyond calling it rare, and they might term it implausible instead. I had a sense that I'd better exit that area in case there were more of those big cats around, but I needed to sit and watch it for a while. It was the most exciting find of my life leading up to that point, and I needed to give in to the excitement that went with me seeing what I was seeing, where I was seeing it. Those of you who think I couldn't have possibly been there looking at what I'm describing, just hang on. The story gets even more unlikely and impossible in a minute. So I was zoomed in and focused and looking at this big tan cat with dark ears. It was too hard to tell the size of the thing from that distance, with it laying flat on the branch the way it was. But it sure gave the impression of being as big as a real lion. I've since read online that they can in fact grow as long as 8 feet. So they can be bigger than a grown man sometimes, and I think this one was. I didn't know that fact on that day though, so I was quite stunned at the massiveness it projected. After some surprised staring on my part, it began to dawn on me that the cat was looking at something. It had to have been hunting something by the looks of it. The crazy eyes kept getting crazier looking, which was the same way my childhood cat would act just before pouncing on a mouse or a bug. I fished around with my scope in the direction the cat seemed to be looking, trying to find what it was getting ready to jump out of that tree and onto. What I found only confused me further. There appeared to be a wolf approaching that tree, but the way it was moving made no sense to me at first. It looked like a wolf's head all right, but it was way up in the air. That wolf head seemed to be only about a foot under the branch that the big cat was hiding on top of, over to my left. I pulled the scope away and squinted over there with my naked eye, and that's when I saw the shadow of the thing moving through the underbrush. It sure seemed as though that wolf head was on top of a humanoid body. Every part of my body felt like electricity was surging through it. In all my time spent watching animals in the woods, I never felt I had any specific reason for doing it. Like when I was a hunter earlier on, I had specific goals to meet when I went out there. Since then, I'd just been spending unscheduled free time in the forest with no purpose to it other than relaxation. Or so I thought. When I realized that I was witnessing a dog-headed humanoid marching through the Wisconsin woods, I put 2 and 2 together, and the math showed that I was watching a Wisconsin werewolf, a real, genuine Midwest monster of the highest grade. I felt truly alive for the first time in years. I hadn't realized how deadened my internal life had become until I saw that dogman, and I came back alive again. This was the reason I was still out in the woods. This was the purpose to what I was doing. I wanted to have the mystery of the wilderness revealed to me or shared with me. I felt such a deep and perfect sense of unified consciousness in that moment. Life suddenly made sense again. After years and years of sadness and depression and loss, there was a reason I was still alive. My entire life had led up to that point, and it was an incredible feeling. I watched the upright canine, as much of him as I could see from my angle, and I wanted to run forward through the woods and find a closer vantage point to view him from. I could not see a direct path from me to him, though. I was going to have to run broken field style, leaping over and under and through the fairly dense woodland to maneuver closer, and there might be other predators between me and him as well. He might not be the only dogman in this scene. Others might be hidden. There also might be more of those big cats. Oh, the big cat. In my near ecstasy of seeing the first cryptid of my life, I had actually forgotten about the big cat. I looked with my naked eye back to where I had been watching the cat hunting something with its eyes just as I had been hunting it with my eyes. The feline was still there, but now its ears were back, its eyes were frantic looking and nearly cross-eyed, its tail wagged, and its back fur stood up on end. It was about to try to end something's life. I watched the dogman approach, and at the very last second, the instant before that tan Puma leaped off of the big old branch onto him, the dogman looked up and saw what was about to happen. He did a kind of almost a martial arts move, where he slipped to the side and turned, trying to avoid the leaping behemoth of a cat. But he was only able to get partly out of the way. Both animals tumbled down out of my sight, and the most terrible caterwauling erupted from that area. Birds that I had not known were there flew from their hiding spots, and all flew away to less violent places. The feral cat and snarling dog sounds were so loud, they actually hurt my ears. I needed to see what was happening, and I knew that this loud and chaotic moment was a gift provided to me by Providence. I could run as hard as I wanted and make as much noise as possible, and I would still not likely be noticed by either of those predators. I did not think there were any other wild carnivores between me and that battle, because there were no more reactions to the loud cat attack besides the birds that flew away. It looked like clear sailing for me, and I grabbed my rifle with the fancy scope on top, and I nearly flew over, under, and between every kind of plant life that grows in Wisconsin, running and jumping like I hadn't done since I was a young and hopeful man. Soon enough, I had a good-looking spot. I had my view of the rumble in the jungle. The two beasts were rolling on the forest floor, and the dust they had kicked up was partially obscuring my view of the action. I saw a good climbing tree a little bit in front of me, and so I climbed up to a fork about 20 or 25 feet up in the air. Then I sat down in it. The dog-headed, hairy humanoid threw the cat off him and stood up on his hind legs, which looked like devil legs, not human or ape legs. The dogman's face appeared demonic to me, at least in that moment. With the dust swirling about him like smoke or fog, he truly looked like some kind of demonic thing risen out of hell. My breath was taken away by the size of it. He had to have been 7 feet tall if he was an inch. The chest on that thing looked like Schwarzenegger in his prime. Its arm reached out and grabbed a thick branch from a nearby tree. Then, in one movement, it tore that branch right off, bringing it down hard into the dust where the cat had been laying. Surprising both me and the dogman, the big cat was not hidden in that dust, where we both thought he would be. Somehow, he had bounced away and was now flying back at the head of the dogman, both arms outstretched, with deadly claws ready to tear the giant canine into shreds. The dogman and the mountain lion met, and the cat's arms wrapped around the fur-covered humanoid's neck. Clearly his claws were digging into the back of the head and the throat, and the dogman was reacting as though in severe pain. He pulled a step or two back to get more space for his counterattack, and for a few seconds I saw that both creatures were the same size when up on their hind legs. How long did I say a mountain lion can get? 8 feet? Well, maybe both of those creatures were 8 feet from the tips of their toes to the tops of their ears. Whatever size the one was, the other was its equal. I knew I was too close to this action, and I knew that whoever won this fight might come for me next. Yet all I could feel was gratitude. Gratitude that I was given this chance to witness this incredible thing going on maybe 15 feet away from the base of the tree I was hiding in. Now, while the dogman stood under his own power, the cat was leaning hard on the dogman in order to keep upright. When he was able to touch down with his hind paws, he was mostly only able to kick at the ground and push himself forward. And so it happened that both creatures, hugging each other like two tired boxers, snapping at each other, trying to get into a position to do more damage, moved backward and backward toward the tree I was hiding up inside of. They crashed back, slamming into the trunk of the tree below me and rocking my whole world. I had to hold on for dear life as that tree shook violently, and I wondered for a moment if they were going to uproot it and knock us over backwards. Using that tree for leverage, the dogman pushed back on the immense cat, forcing it to withdraw its claws and let go of him. Now back down on all fours, the cat had given up a huge height advantage to the dogman. If I were a betting man, I'd have put my money on the upright walking canine at this point in the battle. The cat did something unexpected, though, as cats are wont to do. It ran away from the fight, straight up a trunk in a sort of feline version of a Jackie Chan maneuver, and then flew up onto a branch just slightly taller than the now furious dogman. The canine growled and snarled, and you could see that he was losing his temper and was sort of going berserker on that cat. Reaching his long arms up, the dogman attempted to claw at the cat, but each time the dog reached up, the cat growled and struck back with lightning-fast speed and his own formidable claws. Each of these animals was put on Earth to take down prey in order to survive. Neither of them was created to battle each other, and I realized I could not predict which one would win. They both had long, sharp teeth. They both had long, sharp claws. The dogman had the advantage of longer reach thanks to his long front arms and his ability to stand on his hind legs. The cat had the advantage in terms of speed and insanity. It was also able to climb, which I had not yet seen if the dogman could do. The big cat's claws made it easy for him to grip tree bark and turn the entire forest into his jungle gym. He could perform acrobatics all around the Dogman for hours if he needed to, yet there could be little doubt that the canine would be able to match him in terms of stamina. I think I was getting more exhausted watching this fight than either of the combatants were getting. Growing annoyed at the cat reaching down to strike at him, the Dogman reached up and pulled the branch it was on down, attempting to shake the cat free. That thick branch snapped under the pressure being applied on it, and the Puma was down on ground level once again. No matter what either of them did, the other one had a counter move to level the odds all over again. The cat rose up to strike, and the dog backed off a few feet, coming almost underneath my position in the tree. As I looked down on him, I could see that he was in fact wounded all over the top and back of his head, as well as his shoulders. It wasn't clear if the cat had been scoring in this fight, but when the canine was close enough beneath me that I could smell him, I could also see that even if he won, it would be at a cost. The cat leaped up at the Dogman, attempting to sink its long teeth into the upright monster's throat. The Dogman blocked with his right forearm, and the cat sunk his teeth into that instead. Howling like he had never experienced anything so excruciating, the upright canine swung his arm forward, swinging the cat into another tree and causing it to loosen its grip. That had gotten the Dogman angrier than before, and he dove toward the cat, once again hugging it hard and biting furiously. Both creatures rolled on the ground again, and the dust rose up into the air once more. It made me feel like I needed to sneeze, so I pulled my t-shirt up over my nose and mouth to block out the dust and particles. Once again, the creatures slammed into my tree, but this time I lost my balance and I fell off the back side, the side furthest away from the battle. Every part of my brain that was still conscious told me to get up. Get up or you'll be trampled. Run away or you're not going to live to see tomorrow. Get up. Get up now. The problem was, there wasn't very much of my mind that was conscious, and it was battling the urge to close my eyes and take a long nap. My fall hadn't given me any serious injuries, but it had knocked the wind out of me, and I was giving in to unconsciousness as a result. Crack! Bam! A sound went off that I interpreted as fireworks in my half-dreaming mind. Crack! Crack! Echoed and ricocheted around me. I sat up, shocked. That was the sound of someone firing off some shells. I looked and I saw both the Dogman and the big cat crash away into the forest, each in a different direction, but both to my right. I hid behind that tree as I heard someone approaching from my left. It was two armed men, both hunters from what I could see. I don't think anything was in season at that time of year, so I guess they were poachers or desperate men of some sort. They were speaking excitedly to each other in some language that was not English. It wasn't Spanish either. I'm not very fluent, but I took 3 years of Spanish in high school, so if it was Spanish, I would have at least picked out a word here and there. As it was, the two men stared at the dusty forest floor, looking for tracks, I would presume. The one man started off after the cat, motioning his partner to go in the direction I had seen the Dogman running toward. After they left, I gingerly raised myself into a standing position and checked to see if anything was broken. I was sore in spots, but otherwise fine, so I picked up my weapon off the ground and began my long march home. On the way, I heard shots fired and screaming. I wonder what happened back there. I don't suppose I'll ever know. And that's all I've got to tell you about the time I saw Dogman versus the mountain lion. We're talking about a guy by the name of Tim, because nobody around's more badass than him. Number one on the list and top of the hill, our executive producer is Tim Sturgill. Please join me in thanking the grand and glorious Tim Sturgill for making this episode possible. Tim is a $10 channel member, which means he's so cool, He got to watch this video yesterday. He also gets to see our secret uncensored stories, far too wild to tell on this channel, as well as our over 15 hours of scary uncensored secret stories, soon to be added to with another big long video as soon as I can make that happen. If you'd like to be as badass as Tim Sturgill, just join our PayPal subscribers club or do what Tim Sturgill did and click that join link under this or any of our videos to become a channel member. Dogman. Outside my cabin. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Way back in my young adulthood, I spent about 5 months as a semi-hermit, living in a small but comfortable and relatively modern cabin in the woods. By 21st century standards, I guess it wouldn't be called modern, but I had my own generator so I could have lights at night. I had indoor plumbing, and I even had one of the original Litton electric microwave ovens, a real luxury of the modern world back in those days. But while the inside felt modern and comfortable to me, outside that cabin lurked an apparently prehistoric danger, something that I used to call a dog-headed Bigfoot, but which now would more likely be referred to as a dogman. Back in those days, I was earning a living as a comic book artist for one of the smaller houses that operated out of New York City. I only needed to actually physically be in Manhattan 1 or at most 2 days per month to deliver my newest pages and pick up my next assignment. So it was kosher for me to live way upstate. My cabin was near Brant Lake in a rural area that defined peaceful and beautiful most of the time. I was just on the other side of Lake George from Whitehall, New York, a town that has more recently become famous for outlawing the killing of Sasquatch. Even back then, literally 50 years ago, Whitehall and much of upstate New York was an active Bigfoot region. I knew several people back then who told wild and scary stories about having to deal with the forest people, having to scare them off their property and so on. Nobody I knew wanted to hurt them, and they seemed to usually behave in a peaceful manner toward humans, but they're just too big and too scary to want to have them around. They might hurt you without even meaning to, and some of them, at least according to the stories I heard, could get pretty mean. Back then, I would watch every TV show I could about monsters, as well as listening to any radio show and going to see any movie about what we now call cryptids. Every time I read or heard someone saying that Bigfoot only lived in the Pacific Northwest, I would wonder where they got their information from. Even the people upstate who didn't believe in Bigfoot certainly knew about it, and probably knew someone that had seen it. Nobody that I knew back in those days ever talked about Dogman, though. In fact, when I would tell people about the thing that was harassing me in my cabin, they would usually insist that I had probably seen a Bigfoot, and I just imagined that it looked like a dog. The cabin I lived in was all alone by itself in the woods north and a little to the west of the town of Brant Lake, and the actual lake itself was well off to our east. I was closer to the swampy land to the north than to the town of Brant Lake itself, and there were natural areas preserved for wildlife further north from that. So I could go into town for food or other supplies fairly easily, then go back to being lost in the middle of nowhere when I got back home. I really wanted to get a photo of a Bigfoot, so I carried my camera with me at all times. Back then, you had to shoot on film and then take the film to the drugstore in town to have things developed. I took so many pictures of so many things that they knew me by name at that drugstore. There was another important reason I had my little camera around my neck 24/7 in those days. I needed to take pictures to use for reference for my job in comic books. In comics, you have to draw the same characters over and over from different angles, but keep them looking like the same person each time. Otherwise, the readers can't follow the story. That's harder to do than it seems, and so I would take photos off the TV of different actors and actresses, snapping pics all through TV movies to get references for how that person looked from a distance, from the right, from the left, and in close-ups from various different angles. Then I'd base my characters on those actors. Some guys back then, like Gene Colan, would hire models to base his characters on, but I didn't get paid enough by my company to do it that way. I had to draw both the characters and the backgrounds, so besides TV shows and movies, I would take photos of the country, photos of the city streets, photos of the exteriors and interiors of diners and stores and even the local police station. When I went into New York City to deliver art, I would take pics of the rooftops outside the windows of the high-rise office. There was no internet back then, and you either had to draw from memory, which I was not good at, or you needed reference photos to draw from. If you think all that meant that I got a photo of the Dogman, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but it wasn't for lack of trying, that's for sure. As you're about to hear, I tried to photograph the thing whenever it showed up to harass me, and I failed every single time, too. Another person who would sometimes get caricatured in my comics was my on-again, off-again girlfriend, Bessie. In fact, I was taking pics of Bessie the first time that the Dogman showed up. It was early summer, or at least a very warm, late spring night. I had the windows open, but with screens down to try to keep the mosquitoes to a minimum. Like I said, we were not very far from swampy wetlands, where those blood-sucking insects like to breed. Bessie was helping me out by posing, making different gestures that I needed to draw in the story I was illustrating that month, when suddenly we both smelled something awful. We went around closing windows, but it was too late. That stench had gotten inside. That's when the cabin started heating up, because one of the things I did not have installed was air conditioning. We were both sweltering in the heat for a couple of hours when Bessie got fed up with it and decided to open a window and see if the bad odor had gone away yet. Neither of us spent any time or effort wondering why it smelled bad or what could have been causing it, which seems very strange in retrospect. We were young. I don't have any other explanation for it. So Bessie opened a window on the side of the house, and bam, that odor was still right there. It was not a skunk odor at all. It was like rotten food mixed with a backed-up septic tank. In fact, when she opened the window, my first thought was whether my septic tank, which I had buried outside of the cabin, had busted and sprung a leak. My heart started to race a bit at that thought, because it would mean I would have to spend more money than I had budgeted that month to get someone to come out and fix it. Either that or I'd have to try to do it myself, and that might prove disastrous. I also moaned to myself that I might have to go to the bathroom in the woods for a month until I had enough cash accumulated to get the tank repaired or replaced. I felt really sorry for myself, and I thought I had something terrible to worry about. And then, in the next second, all those worries got replaced by something far worse. The presence of a North American upright walking canid, or Dogman. Bessie screamed. I looked, and there was a dog's snout trying to push its way through the window screen to get in at her. The sound of snarling was terrifying. The creature could not have sounded more frightening or more feral. Bessie slammed the window, and I caught her from tripping as she backed away without looking where she was going. "Mad dog," she and I both said at the same moment. I realized that it was that beast who smelled bad, not my septic tank. In that moment, I would gladly have traded the mad dog in for a broken tank, though. After all, this was the middle of the woods. If some crazed predator wolf, or whatever that was, had decided to mess with us, it was kill or be killed. I took a deep breath and loaded the rifle I had mounted over the fireplace. Bessie said she thought that was just for show, but I was like, Watch me show that mad dog something, Bess. I stationed Bess just inside the door, and I told her my plan. I was going to take 1 or 2 steps out there, look around, take a shot at the canine if I saw it, and then back up inside. It was her job to stand by, then close the door after I got back in. If something went wrong, and I was jumped by the wolf or a dog or whatever it turned out to be, she was to close that door and lock it and protect herself. She was not to open that door again until sunrise, unless she heard me specifically say that the wolf was taken down or that it had run off. Even if she heard me about to perish out there, she was not to open the door when that canine was still in the area. We had our plan, and so I counted down 3, 2, 1, and bam, I jumped out there, swiveling my sight from left to right, looking for the mad canine, or really any movement at all. The oppressive smell of decaying death hit me like someone threw a hot, poop-covered towel in my face. I heard a feral animal snarling and swung around to my right sharply. The first thing I caught in my sight was knees. Hair-covered, furry, dark gray knees. Was that not a mad dog at all? Was it actually a mad Bigfoot? I swung the sight up as fast as I could, moving up over a body completely covered in the same dark gray fur that covered those knees. Up, over the chest, up at least 7 feet into the air to the head, which was the head of a snarling, vicious, wolf-like canine creature with eyes reflecting back a yellowish-white shine that reminded me of owl eye shine more than it did of any mammal. It had an upright standing body, but it was not a man, and it was not a Bigfoot either. It was a monster that walked bipedally, but had a dog-like head, not a human or bear or ape-like skull. It was about 15 feet away from me, and it had already begun to walk quickly in my direction. I backed into that cabin so fast I almost gave myself whiplash. I tried to shout at Bessie to close the door, but it came out as gibberish due to the fear-frozen nature of my face muscles. Bessie pulled the door shut anyway, not having gotten the clear view of the upright walking monster that I had gotten. The dogman banged on that front door like he meant business. I think he was slamming into it with his shoulder, or else maybe running into it. That was a thick and well-made old door, though, so he was not able to get inside. Bessie started freaking out that it was going to climb in the windows. I calmed her down and said we both needed to be quiet so that it would go away. I told her everything would be fine, not letting her know that I too was concerned about it trying to get in one of the windows. After all, it would be a lot easier to break through some screening and glass than a thick wooden door. If the creature decided to do that, I would have no defense against it other than my shotgun, which I did not think would be powerful enough to take that thing down. We turned off the lights and huddled under a blanket, essentially playing dead and hoping the big monster would go away. Eventually, we fell asleep. I woke up when it was still dark out, and I walked to the windows one by one with my camera around my neck. It was my hope to get a picture of the thing and become the first cartoonist in history to be able to draw a monster from a real-life photo. There was nothing moving out there, though, so I climbed back under the covers with Bessie, and I woke up to a bright sunny morning with no giant dogman outside the next morning. I felt silly in the bright daylight for how scared I had been the night before, but Bessie sure didn't. She was still just as scared as ever, and she packed her stuff up quickly. We drove into town to get breakfast, and then she made me drive her all the way back down to her apartment in Queens, which is 4.5 hours away. I brought some of my pages with me and worked at her place for a couple of days, before I had no choice but to head back upstate to finish my assignment for the comic book people. On my way back up north, I made a few pit stops. One was at a lumber place I knew that had decent prices. I bought enough wooden boards and nails to cover up all those windows, so I didn't have to worry as much about the dogman reaching through the screens and glass. I wanted to get nice, solid, thick wooden shutters, but I wasn't a star cartoonist, and I was lucky I could afford the wooden boards and nails that I had bought. I also made a stop to pick up some buckshot, as I was going to need something more powerful to load my weapon with if I had any hope at all of slowing down that creature. The first few nights I was back up at the place went quietly, but I think that might have been because I only ran my loud gas generator during the daytime to power my microwave. At night, I used my old school kerosene lanterns and kept a low profile. Eventually, one night, I got brazen and decided to use the electric lights after dark. I had gotten sick of roughing it to appease a weird monster that, for all I knew, had moved on already and could have been hundreds of miles away. I powered up the generator and lived like it was the 20th century again. While I was living the high life and drawing my comics, I suddenly felt sick as I smelled that terrible odor all over again. I wanted to run outside and turn off the generator, but there was no way that I was going to go outside at all. The place looked like crap with the windows all boarded up like it was Night of the Living Dead or something, but I felt confident and safe, at least, relative to the first time the monster had come around to bother me and Bess. I turned out all the lights and grabbed my camera. I walked around, looking for spaces between the nailed-up boards through which I could try to get a clear shot of that monster. I was scared, but I was also just as excited. In those days, people still felt like getting a clear shot of a monster or a UFO might make them rich and famous. I don't think people really feel that anymore. So, I was nervous in both the sense of being anxious to get my money shot, as well as nervous that I might be about to be eaten alive by a dog-headed Sasquatch. I tried several times to get a good shot at that thing, but it kept constantly moving. I thought I might have gotten its head with its lips pulled back in one shot, but like I said, you didn't know which pictures came out or not until you got them back from the drugstore in those days. Short answer, no, I didn't get any good pictures of the monster. I had taken some shots using natural lighting, but I decided I'd better try with the flash on as well, so I attached it. Back then, you actually had to buy flashes as well as films, and each flash only worked one time, then you'd throw it out. Well, one time was all it took for the dogman to fly into a rage. For some reason, he seemed to take it as a personal offense that I had flashed a light at him, and he went absolutely berserk. He smashed the window I had been standing behind, ripping up both the screen and the glass. The sound of the shattering window seemed to have surprised him, and he ran off. I dropped my camera and raised my weapon instead, positioning myself in the center of the cabin and waiting for that beast to try again to get inside. I could hear it out there running around. It was in front of me. It was to the left. It was to the right. My hands were sweating from fear so much that it was hard to hold on to my rifle. And then I heard the creature doing something to the generator behind the house. It sounded like he was trying to pull the thing free from its moorings. I had placed its legs in wet cement when I first installed it to try to keep it good and secure. Well, as hard as I had worked to solidify it, that's how hard that dogman was working on pulling it over. I heard a really nasty crash and heard the generator putter to a stop. That's when I knew I was going to spend the rest of that night hiding under the covers again in absolute pitch darkness. Stopping the generator noise seemed to please the dogman, as I didn't hear it again anymore that night. In the morning, I went out and saw that he had really wrecked the thing. That generator was beyond repair. I gave up, and within a week I had moved to Queens to stay with Bessie for a while. I was eventually able to sell the cabin, but I couldn't get much for it since it was boarded up like a war had been fought there. The generator was busted, and the interior was generally a mess. If I had some money to repair and fix the place up, I probably could have gotten at least twice as much for it, but as it was, I was glad to be rid of the place and able to start my life over. I didn't really have a right to complain. I wanted wilderness, and wilderness is what I got. I had no regrets at the time. I have none today, and I'm glad I got to stay in such an out-of-the-way place when I was still young enough to do it. Now, in my old age, I live in a safe house, in a safe part of a safe town, and I'm extremely grateful at how extremely boring everything is around here. I recognize it as a gift and a true privilege that never again will I ever smell that terrible odor and know that there is a dogman outside my cabin. I'm going to say it right out loud. Our newest EP is Kevin MacLeod. Kevin joined at our super bargain price of only 99 cents per month, and in exchange, he gets to see our secret uncensored Dogman stories far too wild to tell on this channel.
Dogman in the Bronx was told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ Ribber. This is the true story of how I saw a dogman in the Bronx. I know it sounds impossible, but you should know that since upstate New York has been overdeveloped with a huge infestation of rich people, a lot of the wildlife from up there has traveled down to our neck of the woods to live. Raccoons now regularly rummage through the garbage all the way down to Washington Heights and Upper Manhattan. In 2015, a coyote was captured by the police in Battery Park City. That's as far south as you can go in Manhattan, one of the most modern cities on the planet. I can't explain to you how these creatures migrate down from upstate except to guess that they must leave the parks and green areas to walk south through city streets or maybe through the sewers or over the rooftops. If you look at maps, you could see that there's no way to walk entirely through green or wooded areas from upstate south through the Bronx, let alone down into Manhattan. Also, the creatures would need to walk over bridges without being noticed, or else they'd have to swim across, one or the other. In my opinion, all the coyotes that live in Van Cortlandt parks and the botanical gardens shouldn't be captured and let out again upstate. They should be tagged with GPS devices so we can figure out how they get around. Did you ever see that Will Smith movie about Manhattan after the zombie apocalypse, when computer-animated lions roam free hunting game on Park Avenue? The sightings of coyotes make me feel strongly that we're a lot closer to that reality already than most people might ever guess. Okay, so this happened one day about 6 years ago when I was off from work and I decided to wander over to the Twin Lakes in the Botanical Gardens to hang out. It had been a place I loved as a kid, but I hadn't been there for at least a dozen years. It's really just one tiny lake. The second one is mostly dried up. On maps they still draw both lakes, but they must have copied those drawings from Leif Erikson or something because that second lake has always been a mud patch, even since I was very young. We used to come here to catch crayfish, which are basically tiny lobsters or large water bugs or something in between. We'd have caught fish if there were any, but as I said, the place was mainly dried up and a remnant of the natural wonderland that the Bronx must once have been. Still, catching a crayfish made me feel like I was a real nature boy, like Opie on the TV, so I came back to the Twin Lakes every chance I could as a child. This time when I went back to visit a few years back, I noticed the bridge between the lakes was now a small parking lot, but that the rest of it was essentially the same ugly mess I remembered and loved it for being when I was younger. Yes, it's surrounded by highways. Yes, it's filthy, but it was the closest thing to a patch of nature we had, so we loved it. I still loved it as I stood there, and I took a deep, deep breath of air, then choked it back out as I realized I had breathed in fumes from the exhaust of a passing diesel truck. Maybe the gas fumes started melting my brains, but I swear to you that the next thing that happened was I saw something move in the brush across the lake. I was standing on the parking lot bridge and facing roughly north, and on the north side of the lake emerged a figure walking up to the water. It was later in the afternoon, and the sun had started going down, but it was far from dark, and I could make out the figure pretty plainly. It was a hairy, naked man with the head of a dog. It was Dogman. I let out a gasp, and I think it heard me because it stopped walking toward the lake and stood staring at me. I stared back, and without moving an inch, it bared its teeth, and even at that distance I could hear it growl. I stared back at it in shock until I remembered that wild dogs don't like to be looked in the eyes, and they take it as a challenge. Terrified, I looked down and averted my eyes, then almost immediately got angry at myself for being a chicken. I looked up again, but the creature had taken that split second to back away into the bushes. I saw it take one final backward step, eyes still locked on me as it disappeared into the bushes and trees on the north side of the lake. Idiotically charged with adrenaline, I ran to my left, through the parking lot bridge, and took a right terracing down the lake and into the patch of forest beyond, looking for the thing. I had my phone out and was ready to snap a photo if I saw the creature again, but I didn't see any animals or people over there at all. I did run into some sort of Santeria-looking thing. Someone had painted a weird symbol on a rock in the ground, and there were little pieces of paper rolled up and stuck in the branches of trees all around the rock. I probably should have taken a picture of this ceremonial site, but something told me not to. Growing up in this area, I was taught never to mess with other people's religious beliefs. Wandering around a little bit more and finding nothing, I eventually got bored and went home to Google about the Dogman and email some of my friends about it. Most seemed to think I was just joking. The next day at work, two of my buddies took me to lunch so they could hear the full story. One friend, who happens to be a white guy, felt that I'd seen a rare but natural creature, probably native to upstate like the coyote, who was leaving the forest to drink water from the lake. My other friend, who happens to be Hispanic, felt strongly that I had seen a brujo, or shapeshifter, a male witch or a shaman. He didn't think the shrine in the woods was related to his appearance being that of a wolf man, but he thought it was possible that the shrine had been created by the shape-shifting witch man for other purposes. Then again, it may have been created by any number of people, as the area is quite heavily populated by those who still practice the old customs. I don't know if I can accept the concept of a shapeshifter, but it would explain why nobody else has reported seeing such a creature in this area. Maybe he only appears in that form occasionally, then can change back to human form to walk home. Or maybe it was a real natural creature, and it just got here using the same secret pathways the coyotes and raccoons use, which we humans are still unaware of. The lesson I learned from this experience is that the world is a lot more mysterious than any of us think, and that even in the most overpopulated urban areas, nature reigns eternally supreme. Skinwalker in Manhattan? Was told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ Ribber. I walked home on 9th Avenue through my neighborhood at Chelsea, across from the church with the tall steeple, headed up to the supermarket, when I noticed it. The tile, located between white painted lines on the crosswalk, spelled out in red letters, quote, Toynbee Idea, Movie 2001, Resurrect Dead, Planet Jupiter, unquote. It was an original Toynbee tile. I bent over to study it, marveling that I had never noticed it here before. That's when I spotted the smaller message engraved on what was left of the upper right of the tile, although partially missing what remained read. Quote, every concept of past 500 Y don't exist in Christian heaven. They only exist in Christian hell, unquote. The way the smaller message was written seemed to indicate that it had been done after the tile had been laid down, and therefore by someone other than the original tile maker. However, as I looked closely, I noticed that the letter I was printed very small in both texts, perhaps indicating the same handwriting. Either way, I reasoned, the writing seemed to be referring to the church across the avenue. I felt charged by my discovery. We have so many museums and galleries in New York, yet here was a piece by a famously obscure artist that actually seemed to be making a comment on the church down the block from me. We don't just have museums, we are a museum. Contemplating the magic nature of all of this, I went to the supermarket deli and had them make me a sandwich. After I left, I went back and regarded the tile a bit more before crossing the avenue and walking past the church, which seemed more interesting to me than it ever had before. It was a nice enough spring day, so I decided to sit on a bench behind the church and enjoy my lunch while contemplating heaven, hell, Christianity, and the Toynbee tiles. There was a winding sidewalk path that stretched behind the church and led up to the bench I was sitting on, and I saw an old man walking up to me on the path. I watched as he came closer, then nodded to me and proceeded to sit down right beside me. This sort of surprised and annoyed me. I wanted to be alone, but I didn't want to be rude and walk away. I glanced at him and made the assumption from his appearance that he was Hispanic. He opened his mouth to speak, and he sounded more like a Native American than any other kind of accent. "For what do you hunt here?" he asked me. "For what do I hunt here?" I asked back. Then I answered myself. "I hunt for solitude, for peace and quiet," I responded, hoping he would get the hint and allow me to return to my thoughts and finish my sandwich. "Solitude in public?" he asked, mocking me, adding, "You make strange demands on your reality." "Oh, I see. We're playing ask a question, then mock the answer, are we?" I snorted back. "So then, what are you here hunting for, old man?" "I'm just waiting for my ride," he responded, leaning back and watching the day. "Just waiting for your ride, huh? In the middle of this courtyard filled with benches, you're waiting for your ride. I visualized a UFO coming and taking this guy away." "Just waiting for my ride," repeated the old man. For some reason, I decided to keep the conversation alive. "Where are you getting a ride to?" I half expected him to say the moon or Alpha Centauri, but instead he responded, "Upstate. They've got a nice nature reserve they leave me off at. Of course, I've never gotten a pickup this far south, but I'm not worried. They'll come get me. They always do." "How do they know where to come find you, and who are they?" I asked, getting way too involved in trying to make logic out of the ramblings of some old guy who was probably out of his mind or else just messing with my head. "They come when I make myself known. They respond to the power of my presence." "Who?" I asked. "Who responds to the power of your presence?" He thought for a moment, then replied, "They are the people who come when called. That is all I know about them. My relationship with them involves little other than their kind transport of me back to my home upstate when my hunt is through each time." "Don't you use transport sometimes?" "Transport? Like the bus or the subway?" I asked. "I suppose," he responded. "What do you know of the people who transport you other than that they do? Everything else you can say about them would only be guesswork unless you were to stalk them." "Stalking?" I asked, not liking where this conversation was heading. He stared at me for some time, not saying anything. I could hear a bird in the distance sing a song I had never heard before. I began to go through all the local birds in my head, trying to place the song with each of them, but failing. I wondered what kind of creature was singing that song when the old man spoke. "It is time," he said plainly. "Time?" I asked, turning to see. Nothing. Or, well, I saw the park bench, but there was nobody sitting on it. But standing in front of the bench was a dog. There was now a dog in front of the park bench that the old man had been sitting on. It was a brown and black dog with lighter markings around the face and chest. It wasn't large and it wasn't small. I guess it would have weighed around 50 pounds, maybe. It looked at me expressionless. I gazed around quickly, but could find no trace of the old man. I was aware that I'd been daydreaming, but didn't think I had been looking away from him long enough for him to have disappeared from sight. Maybe I'm on the Carbonaro effect, I thought, then realized I'd said it out loud. Puppy, are we on the Carbonaro effect on the TV? I asked jokingly as I reached out to pet the dog. I was met with the dog taking a step back, crouching a bit and growling. I saw its back first stand on end, and I saw its teeth bared. Needless to say, I withdrew my hand and slowly stood up, backing away from the angry dog. I tossed it the rest of my sandwich, and it didn't even break its stare into my eyes. It did not want the sandwich. It only seemed to care about making sure I knew it was mad. That's the scariest, angriest-looking dog I've ever seen, I said under my breath as I walked backwards out of the courtyard and out onto the sidewalk. I stood in the entrance to the courtyard, watching as the dog grew bored of growling at me, then turned and trotted down the winding path behind the church. Shrugging my shoulders at the entire experience, I turned and walked around to the front entrance to my building and got back to my ordinary day, placing all that had occurred on the back burner of my mind. That night, my roommate got a call from her mother who told her to put on the news. There, on the TV, was the courtyard I'd been sitting in. The reporter was standing on the winding path behind the church and telling us that a coyote had been captured there today. "A coyote?" I exclaimed, surprising my roommate. "I thought it was a dog." I told her I'd seen that animal earlier, but had no idea it wasn't just a dog. "I wonder what they'll do with him," I asked out loud. The TV reporter responded, "The coyote is tranquilized but safe and will be taken to a wilderness preserve upstate to live out the rest of his coyote ugly days in peace." "Aw," said the anchor lady, "I don't think he's so ugly." "A face only a mother coyote could love," responded the reporter, and both of them fake laughed for a while. I was in shock. My roommate turned off the news and just went back to talking to her mom, leaving me standing there staring at the TV, now just a blank screen. I asked nobody, "Did she say they gave him a ride upstate?" I'm certain on that day I was talking to a brujo. Not just any kind of brujo, but the kind that can shapeshift. A Nahual, Noggle, however you say it, Nowal, or a Skinwalker. And I survived the tale because I did not encounter him while he was hunting. I encountered him when he was waiting for a lift home. Don't go yet. We've still got one more allegedly true tale of terror. The Bigfoot of the Bronx, as told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ Ribber. My grandmother grew up in the Bronx back in the 1930s and 40s on a farm, believe it or not. She told me the small farmhouse she was born and grew up in was the only one on the block in those days, and that a tributary of the Bronx River ran through the farm in the back. They did not have running water, and it was her job as a kid to go get water from the river and bring it into the house. The bathroom was an outhouse. They didn't have a refrigerator, but they did have an ice box, which was basically just a box with a big chunk of ice under it or over it, or something that you could keep stuff cold in. I'm not sure how it worked. She had a regular refrigerator by the time I was in the picture. Grandma told me that other than going to school, she virtually never left the farm when she was young, as they had most of their essentials delivered. Milk came delivered before she woke up every morning. The iceman delivered ice. The fruit man pushed his fruit cart down the block daily, and there even was a man who came at least once a week with a cart to sharpen scissors and knives. So in the summer, her life was basically to get up at dawn, milk the cow and goat, feed the chickens, and tend the crops. After dinner, she was allowed to listen to 1 half-hour radio program. Then it was time for bed, and the whole process began again the next day. She told me this information over and over as I grew up, usually following it with a lecture about how easy my generation had it by comparison. I would put up with these boring stories because every so often she'd trot out her good story. The one about the wild man. That was a story I could not hear enough of, and I would never tire of. Story always started with Grandma talking about how one night in the early 40s, she woke up to the sound of a rifle being fired right outside her bedroom window. Rushing out of the house, she found her father staring into the forest behind the farm, ranting in German about a man trying to steal their chickens. Grandma noticed the chicken coop was in fact broken into, and she immediately set about nailing a board over the hole that the chickens were trotting out of. After repairs, she and her dad counted heads and discovered the one chicken was missing. The next night, Grandma slept straight through, but when she got up, she found the chicken coop broken into again, and all but 2 hens and the rooster were completely gone. She woke up her dad, who had also slept through the entire incident, and was angry about it. Her mom was too ill to help them, so Grandma and her dad started taking daytime naps when they could, and took turns at night standing watch over the farm with the rifle at their side. Nothing happened for almost a week. Then the man came back, this time for their goat. Grandma says she was sitting on the back porch on her watch when she must have dozed off because the sound of the goat bleating woke her from her slumber. It was not bleating as though we were frightened. It was bleating the sound it made when welcoming one of the family. Assuming her dad was up, she began apologizing for having nodded off and semi-stumbled in her exhausted state toward the goat. She noticed that her dad was untying the animal, and she started asking him why he was doing that when her thoughts were interrupted by the loudest scream she said she had ever heard in her life. It was a roar, a bellow, and a scream all rolled into one. The sound was so forceful that it felt like someone had punched her in the chest, and she took a step backwards, almost falling down from the sheer power of it. That set the goat to screaming in fright, and the chickens and dogs and half the forest animals as well. Staring at the figure she now realized was not her dad, she tried to focus her eyes and comprehend what was standing before her. It did look like a man, but a very tall one, and he was naked too. I was a big fan of Leonard Nimoy's In Search Of, and so I would try to get Grandma to admit she'd seen Bigfoot. She, on the other hand, preferred to refer to it as a him, and in her mind, he was a caveman of some sort. I showed her drawings of Bigfoot, but she said this was not a monkey. He was not covered in fur, he was covered in hair, and to her there was a major difference between the two. She said it was dark, and she really couldn't make out the face too well. But she, at the time, did not think at all of apes or gorillas. She thought she was face to face with a giant caveman, and she was terrified. Deciding she was no threat, the hairy man took the leash of the goat and turned to walk into the forest with it. Realizing her family could not afford to lose that goat is what Grandma says gave her the courage to fire her rifle just over the man's head. She said he was so immense that she didn't think a rifle shot would take him down, so she hoped the sound would scare him off instead. It worked. He dropped the goat leash and returned to the forest in a hurry, making very little noise. Her father had been awakened by the noise and got outside just in time to see the tall man disappear into the woods. The next day, her dad brought a large supply of barbed wire and metal fencing, and the two of them spent the day fencing in their entire property. She claimed her dad hooked up a gas-powered motor to a Rube Goldberg device he had built himself so that at night the fence was electrically charged. It made a terrible racket, cost too much in terms of gas to power the engine, and succeeded only in electrocuting 2 squirrels and a bird. They turned off the engine for good after the 4th night, but the giant caveman that I think was really Bigfoot never came back. I've searched on Google, and as far as I can tell, this is my first, last, and only report of a Bigfoot-type creature in the Bronx, and it happened within the last 100 years. Determined to find Bigfoot bones, all through my childhood I would spend summer days at my grandma's house digging up holes in her backyard while she watched her soap operas. I dug up a musket ball one time, which showed her that her yard had either been a hunting ground or the site of a battle. On other occasions, I discovered a dragonfly fossilized in shale and impressions of an ancient fern plant in a stone. I never discovered even chicken bones, let alone Bigfoot bones, but each dig was the most exciting adventure of my life. Knowing I was investigating an area that Bigfoot had once called home, or at least migrated through, made every second last 10 minutes for me and every color and scent brighter and sharper. I've never seen a Bigfoot or really anything strange at all in my entire life, but in my mind I relived my grandma's harrowing tale over and over as though I'd been there myself. I would stand there where she stood and imagine the giant hairy man was still there before me, standing where she said he stood. In the 1990s, Grandma died, and my parents sold her house to a family who I told Grandma's Bigfoot stories to, as well as my stories of things I had dug up back there. They were unimpressed and quickly paved over the backyard, covering the entire former farm, and erected a basketball court over it. No idea who owns it now, but I doubt they have any idea of the adventures that took place on that property back in the old days when people still had a direct connection to the land. I'm sure they have no idea at all that they live on the very spot where Bigfoot was once seen, in the Bronx.
Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it with your friends and family that you think might also be interested. If you would like to see more of our work, please consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon next to the subscribe button so that YouTube will alert you when we put out a new video. To become a channel member and gain access to our special perks, you can click that join link under each of our videos. Another option is to join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. You can join for as little as 99 cents on YouTube or $1.50 at peterbernard.com, and that gains you access to our weekly secret uncensored episodes. If you'd like to see our 21 hours of archives of uncensored Dogman stories, then please join at the $3 level or above. To get to watch our shows in advance of the public, please join at our $10 level. That gets you all the perks. We're working on figuring out how to add the $10 level to the PayPal club too. Hopefully that will happen sometime before August of 2021. If you join our channel memberships, you need to check our community page here on YouTube in order to get the links to the secret videos and other perks. If you're in the PayPal subscribers club, Peter will email you all the news and links himself. Once joining the PayPal club, which is Peter's homemade club, please give him a chance to see that you've joined and to compose you a personal welcome email, as none of that is automated. But whichever you join, we'll name you an executive producer for the next available episode. Do you have a scary experience that you'd like to share with us? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LA-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. It's a Google voicemail box, so that means it keeps cutting off after every 3 minutes. If your story is longer than that, please keep calling back and we can piece it together on our end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.